Hi everybody and welcome to another One History Help video with me, Mrs. O'Neill. Today's video is the final of 4 videos which looks at the different time periods from a medicine through time study. So there's already been one on the medieval era, the Renaissance era, the industrial era, and today we're finishing off looking at modern medicine in the 20th century and also up to the present day as well. Hope you've got everything that you need in front of you to be able to take part in this revision, or maybe you're just going to sit and listen. Whatever it is, I hope you find it useful. Let's get started. So here's a brief overview of what we're going to be having a look at. We're going to be spending some time looking at the First and Second World Wars. We're going to be looking at the development of the National Health Service. We're looking at penicillin, and we're also going to be looking at some of the future developments in medicine and also considering some of the problems with medicine in our world today. We're going to start things off looking at the Liberal reforms, which began in 1906 when the Liberal Party won the general election. The Liberal Party are where we have the origins of what we recognise in our country today as the Liberal Democrat Party. The Liberals come to power after many years of Conservative rule. The general populace was pretty unhappy with the way that the Conservative Party was running things, and so they made a change in voting for the Liberal Party. At this time in the early 20th century, the Labour Party has now come into existence. They were started up to essentially represent the rights of the working classes and to be the voice of the working class, hence why they're called the Labour Party. But at this time in 1906, although they were gaining popularity amongst the working class, it was still a relatively new party and somewhat inexperienced. But the Liberals knew that they were gaining in that popularity and pretty much, I think I'm going to say this, they pretty much stole the ideas of the Labour Party and put them into their own election campaign to make sure people would vote for them instead. The Liberal reforms are a big part of what the Liberal Party promised people upon their election in 1906. And we're going to have a look at what those were specifically. First off, we're going to understand a little bit about why the Liberals introduced reforms, introduced changes in the first place. The background to the Liberal reforms, well, to be honest with you, they can be seen across the study of industrial medicine especially, and seeing how government attitudes change towards their involvement in public health. But towards the end of the 1800s, we get a couple of significant events that spur them on, the kind of like short-term causes that act as a catalyst really to pushing forward these stronger changes made for public health. The first one is the Boer War, which happens in the late 1800s, the 1890s, and that is a war that Britain is involved in down in South Africa. And one of the things that really shocked the government is the poor condition that a lot of the men were who turned up for military service. They essentially, a vast majority of them were turned away because they were so unfit and so unhealthy that they weren't able to be soldiers. And this is the impact of the government not getting involved enough in the lives of poor people. And it really shocked them. And it didn't shock them to the point of, oh my gosh, this is really bad for the lives of the poor. We need to do something to make the lives of these people better. This was very much the act of a selfish, self-interested government that wanted to make sure it had enough men to be able to call on in the event of a war. Especially when we get into the time when the Liberal reforms begin from 1906, we are starting to deal with a country that is and a world to an extent, is realising that a war is coming. And of course, they're referring to the Great War, the First World War. And as much as Britain has its attitudes that it doesn't particularly want to get involved, it's kind of aware, especially in the backgrounds in the government, that British involvement in a war is going to happen, and they're going to need to be able to call upon people. And we need to therefore improve what their lives are like in terms of their health, so we have a healthy society of men to be able to call on for voluntary service. In addition to that, we have Booth and Rowntree, who both do studies into the poor in our country, one in London and one in York. If you want to know more about that, then you can take a look at the Individuals in Medicine video. And these reports were so shocking that the government really had to act to do something to improve the lives of the poor. And again, this is very much what the Labour Party was picking up on as well when it was begun in the early 1900s. And seeing that these ideas are popular is something that the Liberals essentially jumped on. So the Liberal government are elected in 1906, and they are elected upon the promise that they are going to improve the lives of the working class. And to do that, they introduce a series of reforms. And the picture, the little diagram there in the last slide that I was talking through with you, I think gives a really nice overview of what they are. First of all, they focus on 3 specific groups in society. They really target the most vulnerable members of society. The first is that of children. And one of the first things that they do is they introduce an act for free school meals, which we still have in this country today as well, where people who come from families below a particular level of income receive free meals at school to ensure they are getting some level of nutrition. There's also the School Medical Inspection Act that is passed as well, because again, we are still dealing with a time where healthcare is not free, no national health service at this time. So knowing that the health of someone in their childhood years will massively impact on their health as an adult, they start to bring in free medical inspections for children whilst they are at school. Also in 1908, we have the Children's Act, and that kind of extends on a lot of the laws that were created towards the end of the industrial era, which looks at, for instance, how many hours a child is allowed to work and the fact that they should really be at school. Another group that they tackle is the sick and the unemployed. No benefits at all before the Liberal reforms. So, for instance, if you were too sick to work, and you couldn't have a job, then you would end up in poverty. There was no extra money from the government to help you, well, live, if you will. And to help adjust that, realising that, you know, this attitude that it's the poor's fault if they don't have a job, and again, Booth and Rowntree are massive influencers in this, the Liberals introduce 2 specific things. First of all, the Labour Exchanges Act, and that was something that Winston Churchill was in charge of. Yes, back at this time, Winston Churchill was a Liberal. When he becomes Prime Minister in 1940, Churchill will be a member of the Conservative Party, and then when he is re-elected again in the 1950s, he is a member of the Labour Party. So he dances around with a lot of his political alliances. So the Labour Exchanges Act sets up something which we still have in our country today, which is essentially job centres. They were known as labour exchanges then. So if you were poor, you could go to these places and they would essentially find you work. So that was set up in 1909, and another significant long-term impact of the Liberal reforms was the National Insurance Act, which was set up in 1911. Again, national insurance is still something we have to this day as well. And the way it works is that when people get their wages each month, a proportion, a section of their wages goes into this big pot known as national insurance. And essentially, the government are able to dip into that pot of money to be able to provide benefits for people who are too sick to work or are having difficulty finding a job. For instance, they, I forget, oh yes, that's what it's called nowadays. Previously, the money that was given to somebody whilst they were looking for a job was known as the dole. And, you know, there was a lot of criticism, as there still is now really, that people were intentionally avoiding getting a job because they still got money from the government. Today we call it job seekers allowance. The idea that you can, if you are unemployed and you have a family, for instance, to support, or for instance, you have needs that needs to be support, maybe medical needs, that the government would give you some money taken out of national insurance to help tide you over until you get a job. So lots of long-term impact here of the Liberal reforms that are still in existence to this day. And again, another one, the third and final group that they wanted to target, well, that sounds really negative, isn't it? To target their reforms on were the elderly. Again, once you got to a position where you were too old to be able to work and you had to give up your job, you didn't get any kind of benefits whatsoever. And a lot of the poor people in our country were the elderly. And what would have normally happened back in the 1800s and a little bit before then as well, and also I must say a little bit into the 1900s as well, is that a lot of these old people would end up in the workhouse. Those absolutely abhorrent places which essentially just swept homelessness under the carpet. So to stop this from happening, to stop elderly people being so poor that they were either forced onto the streets or into the workhouse, the Liberals introduced the Pensions Act. And essentially, again, it is still around today as well, that the government would provide the elderly with an amount of money, a pension, every, I guess it's every week now, is it? Is it every week? I'm pretty sure the pension is issued every week, not too sure. And essentially that money would, again, be able to make sure that they could fend for themselves, be it through access to food, access to medical care, access to shelter, whilst they were in a position that they were too old to be employed. So again, another long-term impact from the Liberal reforms. One thing I did just forget to mention was the National Insurance Act was the brainchild of David Lloyd George. David Lloyd George, who in 1918 will be the first Prime Minister in our country to give women the vote, and also the Prime Minister in 1919 who will represent Britain at the Treaty of Versailles. So lots of kind of long-term impacts here that we can see from the Liberal reforms. Let's just be aware that we are not dealing with a national health service yet. You still had to pay for healthcare access. If you wanted to see a doctor, you still had to pay for it. What we are seeing instead are the beginnings of what is known as the welfare state, and the NHS will go on to be part of that. War is a significant catalyst for medical developments. A lot of medical developments happen through war. We have seen that throughout all of the time periods we've looked at, be it the medieval era, when the ability to go over to the Crusades gave people the opportunity to learn new medical ideas, be it the work of Ambroise Paré during the Renaissance, where safer treatments were come up with for gunshot wounds and for dealing with the problem of blood loss. Be it the industrial era, where during the Crimean War, Florence Nightingale and Mary Seacole were able to come up with developments relating to hospitals and hygiene in hospitals as well. War is a significant factor in the development of medical ideas. One way that war can be argued to hinder medicine is that sometimes governments are less concerned with prioritising medical developments and instead would rather spend their money on funding the war itself. So yes, war is a very strong factor, but it does have its negatives to it as well. We're going to start off by taking a look at the developments that were made during and because of the First World War. In surgery, when we discussed surgery in the industrial era video, I mentioned that there were three main problems with surgery that needed to be solved: pain, infection, and blood loss. The problem of pain was helped to be solved by James Simpson with his chance discovery that chloroform is an effective anaesthetic. The problem of infection was solved by the introduction of antiseptics by Joseph Lister. However, the problem of blood loss was not solved until the First World War, and that is when we get the introduction of blood transfusions. I want to be really, really clear here. Blood transfusions in some form had existed since the Renaissance era. Not, if you imagine, if you are able to imagine what a blood transfusion is like nowadays, where, for instance, someone essentially is hooked up through a drip to a bag of blood. It was nothing as sophisticated as that. And actually some records demonstrate that back in the Renaissance, to help with the concept of blood loss, some doctors, actually used blood from dogs to transfuse into human beings. So blood transfusion isn't a new development of the First World War necessarily. It had been done unsuccessfully since the Renaissance times. And the reason why we get much more successful blood transfusions during the First World War is actually because of other scientific developments that happened surrounding this. So, for instance, Karl Landsteiner was able to do some work in which he was able to identify the fact that human beings do not all have the same type of blood, and that there are different blood groups. And should you try and give a human incompatible blood group in transfusion, say, for instance, you are, I don't know, you are AB positive and they try and give you O negative blood, then your body will reject it. So you have to have the same type of blood. So that's a massive, massive help, and would have kind of stopped a lot of trial and error, you could argue. And it means that a lot of blood would not be wasted. As well as that, forgive me, I can't remember this person's first name, but his surname is Hustin, was able to discover anticoagulants. And that is essentially a way that you can store blood without it clotting, because as soon as blood clots, it's useless for transfusions. You may well have had this. I get this loads of times. I go for blood tests quite regularly because of my Crohn's disease. And I've had so many times where I've gone for a blood test and I get a call to say, oh, sorry, you need to come back and do it again because the blood clotted. It wasn't, it wasn't able to be tested because it clotted. So being able to store blood in such a way that meant it wouldn't clot meant that it was a lot easier then to transport blood to the areas in the war, again bringing it back to World War I, where it would be needed. Blood loss is one of the most significant reasons why soldiers were dying there on the surgical table in battlefield hospitals. They weren't dying of infection straight away. Infection is something that takes a little bit longer to die from. You don't die instantaneously from infection, but blood loss, you can. Blood transfusions are a massive, massive development during World War I that mean that a lot fewer soldiers are dying from blood loss. And this was so important in World War I because, using some historical context about the war, when the war started in 1914, there was this big belief that the war would be over in a couple of months. The war would be over by Christmas. But as we well know, the war goes on for 4 years. And what countries don't have is an endless supply of men to keep taking the place of all of those soldiers who are dying. So essentially, the governments needed to make sure that they were looking after the soldiers they had and making sure that the soldiers they had were able to be healed should they be injured and sent right back out onto the front lines again. So again, this is using a context of why this is happening when it does. That is such a huge part of history. It's not just why does this development happen? Why does it happen at that time? What is it about the First World War that means blood transfusions are developed to such a point where they are very, very effective? X-rays are another great example. X-rays have been discovered before the First World War, discovered in 1895, and oh my gosh, I can see this guy's name in my head, but I can't get the whole thing off. Through. It's like Rottengeiner or something like that. He is covered in the individuals video. I know that for a fact. And he is the one who initially discovers the concepts surrounding X-rays. And what happens is, how we relate this to the First World War is, in the First World War, the necessity is there to get X-ray machines that can be transported to where they are needed. So rather than bringing the soldier to the X-ray machine, the X-ray machine was almost taken to them. And again, let's think about why X-rays are so important during the First World War. Why is it then that they are developed to such an extent? Well, it's because of the nature of the wounds and injuries that soldiers were suffering from. One of the most common injuries due to the nature of fighting on the Western Front was that of shrapnel wounds. Shrapnel being those jagged pieces of metal that would have happened that would have been broken off from artillery shells that would have been fired across no man's land, or a lot of the time actually into no man's land as well. So getting this metal deep into the body was a significant problem because it would cause infection in the body, and also because of the jagged nature of it could really cause damage to internal organs. So people needed to know where that shrapnel was. And I'm sure X-rays have been through with you in your science lessons. If you want to understand them better, please speak to a science teacher, because again, as I've said many, many a times, as much as I really adore medical history, my scientific knowledge isn't that great. But generally speaking, the reason why X-rays are so important for this is that it would show up where the metal was inside somebody's body. And for some soldiers, they find where the shrapnel is and they are able to remove it safely. But for a significant number of soldiers, that shrapnel cannot be removed, because if they did remove it, it would almost cause more problems than it would be if the shrapnel was left in there. So you get lots of stories, not just in the First World War, but in lots of other conflicts as well, that soldiers actually live the rest of their lives with this shrapnel inside their body. So X-rays, again, let's think about it. That's such a high level of history. Why is this happening when it does? That is such a key question to be asking yourself. Why does it happen now? Look at the improvements of science and technology here that are enabling this. Previously, if someone got a shrapnel wound, it'd be like, oh, well, I can see where it went in, but I'm not too sure exactly where it is now. Not that I'm saying if you got a shrapnel wound in your shoulder, it would end up being in your toe, but nonetheless, this idea, especially if it was kind of lodged within a vital organ, again, this idea just would have been completely unaware, they would have been unaware of it had it not been for the development of X-rays. Another one here is plastic surgery, cosmetic surgery, and I'm not talking like boob jobs and bum lifts here. We are talking about actual aesthetic surgery. And an individual here we can attribute to this is Harold Gillies, who, for those of you who are taught by me at the moment in the local area where I teach, he is a significant individual to our area. There is a statue dedicated to him, and there is also a doctor's surgery named after him as well in my local area. Now, Harold Gillies is developing and perfecting the use of skin grafts at this time for burn victims. And if you are unaware of what we mean by a skin graft, let's imagine that you have a wound on your face. Let's imagine it is a burn that is quite a strong burn that has destroyed several layers of your skin to the point where effectively your face, your skin on your face won't be able to sufficiently grow over it again. So what they do is they take skin from other parts of your body, areas that, you know, for instance, won't be usually seen. For instance, it could be taken like from your bum cheeks or the back of your legs, and they instead graft that skin. They kind of sew that skin over the top of it, and instead the body is able to almost okay, this is where my scientific knowledge is and my biological knowledge is failing here, but essentially that grafted skin becomes part of the skin on your face. And yeah, you'd still be able to see perhaps like a line around the edges of where that skin had been grafted onto you, but it is a lot less than it would look like had it just been left without the graft over the top of it. And yes, you could argue that, yeah, okay, well, that's really you could argue quite shallow, you know, plastic surgery, shallow, like, you know, just because your face looks like that. But actually, there are deeper connections here to the psychological damage that happens from being a burn victim and other kind of wound injuries as well that are happening. We're going to talk a little bit more about mental health in World War I in just a second. But again, let's think about why is this happening now? And it's because of the nature of the gas attacks that happened on the Western Front. So you are going to get the odd occasion where people are getting burns from fire, but you are also getting an increase of chemical burns through the use of things like chlorine at this time during the Western Front, during the Western Front, with the use of gas. So that is, again, us bringing this all together as why is this happening now? As we're going to see in a second when we move on to World War II, plastic surgery and skin grafts are further developed during this time. I mentioned it beforehand, but we are seeing during the First World War the first time when mental health and the psychological damages of war are being recognised. And the main category we see that under is colloquially known as shell shock, this idea of being frightened when you are remembering the sound of shells exploding. But we have gone on to categorise that in a wider sense now to mean PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And nowadays that phrase isn't just applied to war and situations of that, it can be applied to several circumstances relating to trauma. Now, before this, it's not to say that soldiers weren't mentally affected by war. Of course they were. A significant number of survivors in wars previous to the First World War were significantly damaged psychologically from what they went through. However, previously, being seen to show elements of poor mental health because of that had you labelled as a coward. It was not dealt with in a very healthy way whatsoever. Following on from the First World War, we start to see that change dramatically. And we're starting to get as well, just kind of again, understanding why this happens at this time. In the early 20th century, we're starting to get developments in the understanding of psychology as a whole. So it's understanding that we're starting to see overlaps with the impact of war on psychology, along with the kind of general interest in psychology that was going on in the early 20th century too. So that's, again, a good long-term impact if we think about, you know, we're 100 years ahead now from when people are first looking into the ideas of trauma and PTSD, and think about how far mental health treatment has come, but also how far it still has yet to go. We also see the increase in the use of antiseptics in battlefield hospitals, but these are by no means perfect. We see a lot of use of antiseptics, for instance, the likes of Joseph Lister was developing. They have become more sophisticated than a carbolic spray, but nonetheless, the idea of cleanliness in surgery is incredibly important. Aseptic surgery is the main environment that happens now, so surgery that happens without any germs there whatsoever. But again, like I've said here, it is by no means perfect, and they are still very much in the early days of trying to find effective ways to treat infection inside the body rather than on a superficial wound. Say, for instance, if you had a lung infection or something like that. We also see, in terms of surgery, developments of leg splints to help mend broken bones as well. Now, this is really fascinating, and as part of the new medicine course that exists, we don't get to go back to prehistoric medicine, but something that I learned about when I did my GCSE in medicine through time. And actually, we have evidence of the prehistoric peoples knowing how to treat broken bones. And we have evidence from looking at people's skeletons to see when you look at their bones, you can see there would have been a break previously and how that break has been healed within a bone. So by looking at that evidence, we know that they must have had a way to understand how to set broken bones to make sure that they could heal. And we further that understanding by using anthropology, by looking at societies on our planet that have continued to live in similar ways to the prehistoric peoples. Not that we have a huge number of those peoples nowadays, but say like 100, 200 years ago, there were still people on our earth that were living in a very, very similar way. So that's how they kind of, historians join the dots to that extent. So the leg splints that are developed during the First World War are much more sophisticated than the kind of things the prehistoric people were doing. But I just want us to be aware that they are not the first time where we're seeing this idea of broken bones being set as a development, but it is much more sophisticated here in the First World War. One thing I want to say before we move on to look at the Second World War is that a big idea of war as a factor developing medicine and health is really, really strong. And one of the things that I would say is that it provides that pressurized environment, that need of we need a solution to this problem and we need it now, is a massive catalyst for making improvements. However, how I would take that forward, that idea forward, is I would say that these ideas can then be perfected and developed and used on civilians during peacetime. So it's not to say that they get it spot on exactly right during war. Those developments are made in a way that they suit the circumstances, and they can then be perfected following on when the wars are over and more time can be spent on perfecting things. Moving on then to look at the Second World War, and a key difference in the developments in the First World War and that of the Second World War, although we are going to see some similarities, but a key difference is that the developments made are not just for those who are fighting. There is a significant development in terms of healthcare for the general population as well. And the reason is because compared to World War I, the citizens and civilians of Britain were actually involved in the war, especially, for instance, through bombing campaigns that happened and the restrictions that were brought in on behalf of the government. We get lots of propaganda like the one that you can see here, for instance. I'll give you a second to take a look at it. Notice how the nasty attacking germs actually have swastikas as flags as well. So kind of tying together this idea of the fight against the Nazis being the same as the fight against germs as well. So it's kind of like this poster is saying, if we kind of read between the lines here, you know, guys, come on, we've got a big enough job going on here trying to look after our soldiers. We really need you to be looking after yourselves. And what I love is, just think like this. So this poster, I don't know the exact date for it, but let's just say it's early 1940s. Let's go back 100 years to the 1840s. You would never have got a poster like this. Firstly, because germs would never have been heard of before. And also the government wouldn't really have cared at all. So look how far forward we have come in the space of 100 years. Though, as we're going to see, things aren't perfect. So we see a lot of, like I said, similar developments being made during the Second World War, kind of carrying on from the developments made in the First World War. So blood transfusions, for instance, are used a lot more regularly and could be stored for a lot longer as well. In Britain and also in America as well during the Second World War, there is a massive drive for the civilian population who are not out fighting to be donating blood as well. You may well know people nowadays who are blood donors. It is very, very common in our society, and I think it is one of the most honourable things a human being can do. So blood transfusions still being used. By the time we get into World War II, they have been perfected to such a way that blood could be stored for a lot longer than it had been previously. And we're starting to see now that the civilian population are getting involved in this as well. Continuing on the work of plastic surgery that Harold Gillies developed during the First World War, we see more plastic surgery happening for skin grafts for burns, and we are talking less now about chemical burns and more back to the idea of burns caused by fire. And that is because a significant proportion of the fighting that took place during World War II was air warfare. And because of that, we get a lot of pilots who are surviving from planes that have exploded, for instance. And also we get an increase in naval warfare during the Second World War as well. So again, we're starting to see skin grafts being used for more conventional burns caused by fire. Again, why do developments happen at the time when they do? We aren't really treating so many wounds for fire in World War I because we don't have anything like the air warfare. Yes, there is some naval warfare and there is some air warfare as well, don't get me wrong, but it's nothing compared to the scale that we would see in the Second World War. Again, back on the home front, we're seeing developments as well. The British government introduces rationing straight away to help improve people's diets. Rationing was also used in the First World War. It's introduced in 1916 under the Defence of the Realms Act, but it is nothing compared to the significance of the rationing that takes place in World War II. I'm hoping you're familiar with rationing. It's the kind of thing that you learn about when you're in primary school, when you are restricted in terms of how much food you are able to purchase to make sure that the supplies can go around everybody. I was thinking at one point with coronavirus and COVID-19 that was something that they would start to do, the government would start to do. They would start to bring in laws which said you are only going to be allowed this number of eggs each week and so on and so forth. And in a way, actually, a lot of supermarkets did take that upon themselves, didn't they? A lot of them said you can only buy 2 bottles of hand sanitizer, for instance. So 21st century rationing there, you could argue. The impact of that is that we see a significant improvement in people's diets, a lot more people getting more nutrients into their diet as well. People are also encouraged to grow their own food. The famous propaganda poster from World War II stated that people should dig for victory. So we get a lot of people developing allotments, growing their own vegetables and fruits where they can as well. And what's interesting is that rationing continues when the Second World War finishes. So as soon as World War II is over, they're not like, okay, everybody, have as much sugar and eggs that you want. They carry it on. And in fact, my mum, who was born in the early 1950s, she remembers elements of of rationing as well. So it's something that they kind of phase out over time. It isn't just food that is rationed. They also ration, for instance, things like fabric and metals as well. Again, to make sure that there is enough to go round, but in particular with metals, to make sure that the metals are being used for the war effort. And there is evidence of people like donating things like pots and pans and iron railings to the war effort to make sure that things can be built and there will be enough supplies. Vaccination is also strongly recommended through government propaganda. It's kind of similar to the poster that we saw beforehand. It was almost like, do your bit to prevent yourself from getting illness. You know, we are going to have a tough enough time treating all of these soldiers, let alone having to treat people from illnesses that can be prevented. My gosh, I'm just saying that out loud and it sounds so 2020, doesn't it? It sounds so coronavirus. You know, let's not overstretch the health service. Being careful, though, that during World War II, there is no national health service. But taking care, do your bit. If you can prevent an illness from happening, do it. If you can improve your diet, then do it. If you can make sure you are living a more hygienic life to stop germs from causing infection inside your body, then do it. We've got a tough enough job dealing with all of our soldiers and making sure that they are fit and healthy without needing to deal with people who are in the government being careless. We have got a lot more sophisticated surgery going on by World War II. I mentioned to you in World War I that shrapnel in some elements would just be left in the body because it was deemed too complicated to remove. During World War II, surgery has developed into such sophistication where a lot of shrapnel is now able to be removed and vital organs can be healed, can be protected against further complications with that in mind. And one of the big developments that happen on the back of this are improvements in heart surgery and heart transplants even. So World War II, again, picks up the developments of the First World War, develops them, and also does a lot that includes the general population as well. Let's start to talk now about the National Health Service. We've gone on for long enough now with me saying, let's be aware that there is no NHS at this time. Let's talk about the actual introduction of the NHS service. I absolutely adore this picture and I always use it when it comes to teaching the National Health Service because it is one of those things that just sticks in your head massively. And I know from my experience when students are struggling to understand why the NHS was introduced, I would say the phrase, "Oh, rare and refreshing Beveridge," and it all comes back to them because this is just one of those cartoons that just sticks in your head that I find. Let's learn a little bit more about this rare and refreshing Beveridge, William Beveridge. So in 1942, William Beveridge conducts a report into the living conditions in our country, and it is known as the Beveridge Report. And this is done 100 years after Edwin Chadwick does his report into the conditions of the poor. And his report, Beveridge's report, essentially, do you know what? Gosh, it probably identified almost identical to what Edwin Chadwick had found 100 years earlier. He basically realised that the poor are still living terrible lives and they are living in really appalling conditions. So, you know, we've talked a lot about progress, haven't we, really, in this video so far? But there is still a lot that is wrong, especially in the gap of a century. Despite all of the changes that governments have made in becoming more involved in public health, there are still problems with the lives of the poor. And in Beveridge's report, he identified 5 giants that were ruining the lives of the poor. The problem of want, the idea that poor people didn't have enough and were still living below a poverty line. The ignorance of the wealthier members of society to what the lives of the poor were like. Disease, the idea that illness is still a massive problem for the poor because of the poor living conditions that they live in. Squalor, dirt, uncleanliness, and idleness, again, on behalf of those people who are in charge to do something about it. And what Beveridge does in his report is, he says, to improve this, we need to set up a system which looks after all of our people from cradle to grave. From the moment you're born to the moment you die, we should be looking after our people. And his idea would take the already existing national insurance system that the Liberals set up, and alongside this, he proposed the idea of a free national health service. So Beveridge is suggesting this idea. The working class members of our society understandably loved this idea. And the important thing is, and if we think back to that oh rare and refreshing Beveridge picture, these are the vast majority of the people who are out fighting in the Second World War. You know, so it's like the situation of, we're here, we are fighting for our country, yet our country clearly doesn't respect us enough to get free access to healthcare. We deserve free access to healthcare for all that we have done during the Second World War. That's a really, really significant part to it. The richest members of society are not such fans of this. And the reason is because it is their taxes that are going to have to pay for a completely free national health service. And also there's an element of snobbery within that as well. So Beveridge comes up with this idea in 1942. World War II is still going on at this time. So until the war is over, it can only really be left as a suggestion. There is just not the facilities, the equipment, the time to dedicate to setting up such a national health service. We're now going to move on to understand when the National Health Service is set up and what that looked like. And we're going to be learning about another individual, the guy you can see here dressed up as this matron feeding these doctors, a guy called Bevan, or Bevan as he's also called. Great source, this one as well. Really clear understanding this queue of doctors being really unhappy with the National Health Service idea. Bevan, Bevan, was the Labour MP who was in charge of creating the National Health Service. Just want to give a bit of political context here. The Labour Party were elected to power following on from World War II in 1945. Unbelievably, Winston Churchill is not voted to be the new Prime Minister in post-war Britain. Instead, that job goes to the Labour politician Clement Attlee. And this is important because, remember, the Labour Party were set up originally in the early 1900s to represent the rights of the working class. Remember, it was the working classes who essentially fought for us during World War II. So Clement Attlee and the Labour Party campaigned for their votes by saying, if you vote for us, we will give you what you deserve, which is a free national health service. And voila, they are voted for, and that is exactly what happens. Shock horror, politicians being true to their word. So Bevan's ideas are that 3,000 hospitals, these are the hospitals that already exist in our country, are to become nationalised. And that means that they will effectively be owned by the government. Previously, they are largely charity run and so on and so forth. And Bevan argued that yes, this is going to be a significant cost. It's going to cost a fortune to do this, but we can't not do it. It has to be done. It is essential for the people of our country, for them to have a free national health service. Doctors were very much against the idea of a national health service. Remember, doctors had become very rich over the centuries because they could charge rich people lots of money to get their medical advice and be treated by them. And they feared that suddenly if you make healthcare free, they are going to lose out on a lot of money, which if you think about it, is kind of logical, isn't it? You know, if you're going to make healthcare free, you know, how am I going to get any money? Okay, I'm not going to do this job for free. I'm not going to be a doctor for free. So they were dead against it. And in January 1948, the British Medical Authority, the BMA, did a survey of doctors, and 90% of them said that they would not cooperate with the NHS. Good luck, Bevan, setting up a nationwide free health service with only 10% of the doctors on board. So Bevan had some work to do. So what he did was he compromised with them. Bevan was a very strong-minded individual. He was not going to shift on the idea of a national health service. He was convinced that it was what the country needed. But he was a realist enough to understand that he needed the doctors on board if that was going to happen. So what he did was he compromised with them and he promised them a salary, a decent salary. And he also said that as well as treating people for free under the National Health Service, you can still see private patients as well. And you may well be wondering, why would anybody pay to see a doctor when they could get health access for free? And it kind of goes back to snobbery. It goes back to this idea of I want to show that I can actually afford the access to private healthcare. Nowadays, people access private healthcare because it means they can circumvent, they can go around the National Health Service and get things like treatment a lot quicker. So on the 5th of July, the NHS opens its doors for the first time in 1948. And by the time that date comes around, 90% of doctors have changed their mind and say they will be part of it. So now Bevan has got the backing that he needs. And when it first opens, the NHS is very quickly overwhelmed by demand. You get a lot of people, for instance, wanting to get their eyes tested and getting NHS glasses. You get lots of people taking advantage of NHS dentistry. My grandmother is one of these people. She did this, although she didn't do it at the time, she did it a little bit later on. And my nan, bless her, she had all of her teeth removed, all of them voluntarily had all of her teeth removed and got false teeth instead. Again, she didn't do this in the 1940s. She did this a couple of decades later because she could do so. The NHS would do that for her. And she did that because she was like, well, if I'm going to lose my teeth anyway, I'd rather just get the whole set now, which I think, you know, is a bit of a baller move in a way. Let me just have all of my teeth removed and have that done instead. Bless her. So it was largely overwhelmed, but nonetheless, it was largely respected as well. And it very quickly became a badge of honour of our country. And we're going to go on in a little bit towards the end of this presentation, the end of this video, to talk about the difficulties that the NHS faces nowadays. But, you know, it's hard. I'm not supposed to really get political, but I really do believe that the NHS is one of the greatest things in our nation. Actually, screw it. After me, it's the greatest thing about this country. And I generally think it's something that should be protected at all costs. And during this time of coronavirus, we are really seeing how valuable the National Health Service is and how much more funding it needs and how much more respect the people of the NHS really deserve. I would not be here today if it wasn't for the National Health Service. For all of the treatment that I have been able to have for the illness that I suffer from, if I lived in America, I would have to pay thousands and thousands of pounds for that treatment. And I get that treatment for free in this country because of the National Health Service. And I would not be here today if it wasn't for it. So I am a massive fan of the National Health Service and believe it should be protected at all costs. And I am hoping with this whole kind of, you know, clap for carers, clap for the NHS thing that we've been doing during the coronavirus, during the lockdown, I'm really hoping that our government are going to step up and give the NHS the resources that they deserve. And I'm going to step down off my soapbox about the National Health Service now. We're going to move on now to look at developments surrounding antibiotics, and the individuals that I'm going to be talking through can also be found on the Individuals in Medicine video, which I have referenced several times during the last 4 videos that I have done on the different time periods. A lot of people believe that penicillin is the first antibiotic in the world. It's not. It is the first antibiotic that can be used for more than one illness, is what I would say. The earlier evidence surrounding antibiotics are about these things called magic bullets. And magic bullets are chemical compounds which target specific bacteria. So they act literally like a bullet in the body, into that bloodstream, targeting the bacteria. And again, as it says, they were made for specific illnesses. So you wouldn't have one magic bullet for lots of different ones, like penicillin, for instance, will eventually become. An early one that we can reference is in 1905 with a guy called Paul Ehrlich. He is a German scientist who worked under Robert Koch, and he does a lot of his methodology based on being a scientist in Koch's team. And he comes up with a magic bullet, an early antibiotic to treat the bacteria for syphilis, a sexually transmitted illness, syphilis, and it is called Salvarsan 606. And the reason that it's called Salvarsan 606 is because they did 605 different chemical compounds until they found the right one. So as I always say, if at first you don't succeed, try 605 times and you should hopefully come up with the right one. So Paul Ehrlich's, Salvarsan 606, which is used to treat syphilis. Now, before we get too carried away with this, Salvarsan 606 is successful in killing the bacteria for syphilis. Brilliant. However, it also kills the patient. Not so great. Back to the drawing board, it seems. But nonetheless, the theory is there. Can chemicals be used to target specific bacteria? Yes, they can. Can chemicals be used to target specific bacteria and also keep the patient alive at the same time? Let's hope so. The next one we have is a bit of a leap forward. 1932, Gerhard Domach, another German, discovers a chemical compound called Prontosil, and that is used to kill off the septicemia bacteria, and that is blood poisoning. Septicemia is blood poisoning. And the fact that Prontosil works in doing that is an example of something happening by chance, because he is able to test it on his daughter. Her daughter pricks her finger on an infected needle. Kind of feel like maybe social services might want to get involved in what's going on in the Domach household if there are infected needles just lying around for someone to prick their finger on. But nonetheless, she pricks her fingers on an infected needle. So Gerhard Domach, being the scientist that he was, says, aha, this is a time for me to try out my Prontosil to see if it will kill off the septicemia bacteria. And it is successful. Not only does it kill off the septicemia bacteria, but also his daughter survives. So Gerhard Domach is able to come up with a chemical compound which not only targets a specific bacteria, but also enables the patient to survive. We're now going to see how all of this kind of early work can be seen in the developments surrounding penicillin. And it's this individual here who is the go-to individual when looking at the discovery of penicillin. It's Alexander Fleming. Let's learn a little bit more about him. I have very strong opinions about how far Fleming deserves all of the credit pertaining to this, but I'll talk to you more about that as our slides go on. So we can trace the origins of penicillin back to the First World War, and Alexander Fleming was sent by the British government to battlefield hospitals on the Western Front because they wanted to understand, why do people keep dying? Why are our soldiers dying? You know, we're doing work on making sure they're not losing blood, but something seems to be happening. It must be to do with an infection. And Fleming is able to take blood samples and so on and so forth, and using super powerful microscopes is able to identify this specific bacteria called Staphylococci. And he is able to notice that chemical antiseptics are unable to target this bacteria. It is completely resistant to any kind of chemical intervention. So that is starting to spark this idea of, we need to be developing ways that we can tackle infection like Staphylococci inside the body. Fast forward to the late 1920s, when Fleming is doing his work in his laboratories. If you go back to that previous little picture we were looking at, all of that, those Petri dishes that are stacked up are him doing lots of different experiments on different types of chemical compounds and so on and so forth, trying to identify how this Staphylococci bacteria can be killed. And this is another example here of chance in medicine, which is where Fleming is away from his laboratory for an amount of time. I remember when I was at school, I was taught that he went on holiday. I don't actually know how true that is, but nonetheless, he left one of his Petri dishes out on the lab, and his windows in the lab were open. And when he returned from his holiday, or whatever it was he was doing, he took this Petri dish. He said, oh my gosh, this has been left out. And he picks it up and he looks at it and he's like, hang on a second, there's mold on this and it's killing off the bacteria that's inside it. Again, if you go back to the slide beforehand and you see that Petri dish with that zigzaggy line, which is the bacteria, and that white circle around, down towards the bottom, that circle is the penicillin. And you'll see this kind of almost like a halo effect around the outside of that mold, which is demonstrating it killing off the bacteria. And he decides to name this mold penicillin. And he is able to work out that if the mold was diluted, it could kill off bacteria without harming cells. So you don't just literally take the mold as it is and knock it back. You dilute it with other chemicals to make it safe to be ingested, and it would target the bacteria within the cells inside the body, and it would get rid of that bacteria but leave the cells undamaged. That is huge. This is let's compare that to Salvarsan 606, which was killing its patients as well as the actual bacteria. Penicillin, Fleming is able to develop it to such a way that it can kill bacteria, but maintaining the health of the individual. But the issue is that Fleming is still working on this idea of treating surface infections, not delving deeper inside the body. In 1929, he wrote about his work on penicillin in a medical journal, but he just kind of left it exactly where it was. It was written in a journal, put up on a bookshelf somewhere, and that was the end of that. He doesn't continue his work. He doesn't carry out any tests on animals or humans or anything like that. It is full of just theories. So because of that, it goes largely unnoticed until we get these two individuals, Howard Florey and Ernst Chain. They are going to take Fleming's initial work on penicillin and transform it into the drug that we recognise today. In 1938, Florey and Chain read Fleming's article that was in that medical journal up on a dusty shelf somewhere and realise that, hang on, this has got potential. This is significant. I can't believe Fleming didn't take any of these ideas further. So what they do is they go to the UK government and they ask them for funding. They say, look, we want to develop this. Please, can you give us some money because we think it's a really, really big deal. And the British government give them £25, 25 English pounds. And if you're thinking that's super stingy, on the one hand, yes, you're right. However, on the other hand, why are things happening when they do? Remember that kind of thought of thinking. Thought of thinking, train of thought. In 1938, Britain are very much preparing the country for World War II. Some of you may well learn about the causes of World War II, and you'll learn that 1938 is a significant year where Britain transforms itself from appeasing Hitler and really hoping that a war won't happen to realizing that Hitler is, on a conquesting front and war is going to be inevitable. So yes, on the one hand, our government is being kind of stingy, but on the other hand, they're saving their money to put into getting this country ready for war. Not to be downhearted or anything, Florey and Chain go to America. Let me backtrack on that actually. Florey and Chain don't go, Florey goes. Howard Florey goes on his own. And the reason is because Ernst Chain was a German Jew who escaped to Britain at the beginning of the 1930s when the Nazis came to power. So it wouldn't have been safe for him to go and travel, to the likes of America. So Ernst Chain stays at Oxford University, which is where Florey and Chain met, where they were doing their work. And instead, Howard Florey flies over to America and asks them for money instead. And America says, sure, how much do you need? Get my checkbook. They see the potential in what Florey and Chain are after. And if you're thinking, well, hang on, why aren't they using their money to get ready for World War II? Well, it's because, and those of you who've studied 1930s and 40s America will know this already, It is because in the late 1930s, America is still very much in their isolationist attitude. They know that a war is brewing in Europe, but they are not interested in taking part. So unlike Britain, who are putting all their money into preparing for World War II, America are not doing that. So the American government are able to give Florey and Chain much more than £25. I think they go into the hundreds of thousands of dollars worth to be able to fund their research. Obviously, this will change slightly in 1941 when America enters the war. But as we're going to see, all it does is it kind of, again, acts as a catalyst, speeding up the mass production of penicillin, because America are like, right, we gave you all this funding. You said you can use it to stop infection. They know infection is a huge reason why soldiers die because of injuries. So let's make sure that that doesn't happen. So again, that catalyst, that pressurized environment. Florey and Chain, in their research phase, test penicillin on mice, and they notice that you need large quantities of the drugs for humans. I think they recognize that you need something like 4 times as much penicillin to treat a human than you do a mouse. 4 times doesn't seem very much, does it? I'm doubting myself now. But anyway, nonetheless, you need a large quantity of it to test on the humans. And they proved this further in 1941 when they get a policeman, Alexander Albert, his name was. He had got an infection when he cut his mouth on a rose thorn, and it gets infected. And Florey and Chain approach him and say, look, would you be willing to test out this drug to see if it will cure your infection? And he says yes. And the penicillin works on clearing out his infection. And they go to such lengths of trying to make sure that they have enough that they even are kind of extracting the penicillin from this guy's urine to make sure that he can continue to be treated. But eventually the penicillin runs out, and sadly the policeman dies. In the tragedy of this policeman's death, however, we are able to learn that you need to take penicillin for a set period of time. And if any of you have ever been on antibiotics, such as penicillin or derivatives, such as maybe amoxicillin, you will know that you have to complete the course of the tablets, of the medicine. Even if your symptoms improve and say your infection goes away, you need to take all of the drugs, because otherwise, if you stop, the infection will come back. It needs to be in your system. That penicillin, that drug needs to be in your system for a period of time to successfully kill that infection completely. So that's what we learned from this situation. One of the big things that America does when they enter the war in 1941 is they give interest-free loans to companies, to factories, to help mass produce penicillin. Penicillin is quite complicated to make. Again, ask a science teacher, they'll be able to tell you this in a lot more detail than I can if you are interested. But essentially, penicillin is something that is grown as a mold. It's something that is grown, and you need the right conditions for that to happen. And the huge tanks that were available, say for instance, in a lot of the chemical companies in America, were ideal for mass producing penicillin. So like I said here, the American government goes to these companies and says, we will give you money to change your production to produce penicillin in huge quantities. And of course, they take up that. And the big time when we see when we see penicillin being used at its strongest is D-Day in 1944, June 1944, where 2.3 million doses of penicillin are used on soldiers and successfully prevent them from any further infection, and also from dying from said infection as well. So lots of different factors here. We've got communication, reading Fleming's article, and also that travel to America. We've got science and technology, using the scientific experimentation on mice and also the policeman as well. We've got the technology in regards to the mass production of penicillin. And of course, we've got the factor of war, which has both helped and hindered the developments of penicillin, hindering from the point of view of not being able to get enough money from the British government, but helping because it provided that pressurized environment of needing to make sure that there was enough penicillin to be able to use on the soldiers. And it is, in my opinion, that I feel personally, it's an opinion, it's not a fact, in my opinion, I feel it is Florey and Chain who deserve that credit for the developments of penicillin, in my opinion. Florey and Chain, Alexander Fleming, they are all dealt with in the Individuals in Medicine video, so please feel free to check that out if you want to go in, hear any more specific details about these individuals. Finally then, we're going to be having a look at some of the long-term impacts of modern medicine, bringing it as close as we can up to the modern day here in the 21st century. It is worth recognising that the National Health Service was significant in changing a lot of the problems with the past. The idea of being able to provide free healthcare to all is a huge achievement. However, we do need to recognise that here in our modern day, there are problems with the National Health Service where it is overstretched and underfunded as well. And of course, I don't want to get back on my soapbox about the National Health Service. I spoke about that earlier. That is something when we talk about the long-term significance that you can mention. So when you come to answering exam questions on, how significant was the development of the National Health Service, yes, you can say it changed a lot of the problems of the past, but in the long term, it is generating problems as well because the government is not putting sufficient funding towards it that it needs. Also, we are now facing problems nowadays with penicillin, and across the world it is recognised that we have been using antibiotics now for so long that a lot of infections are developing that are resistant to antibiotics. And what we start to see is propaganda like the poster that you saw in the last one, is that doctors are now a lot less willing to give out penicillin or other antibiotics unless it is absolutely essential, because the longer we're using them, the weaker we are actually making people's immune systems over time. What this means is, I find this so fascinating, we're starting to see that medicine is going full circle. And what a lot of people are starting to do now is, rather than being treated with chemical drugs, is a lot of people are turning to herbal remedies. So for instance, say you're having difficulty sleeping, rather than going to your doctor and getting sleeping pills, a lot of people are looking at things like herbal teas, the use of lavender for relaxation, and things like melatonin to help induce sleep. We've also got things like alternative therapies, hypnotherapy being used a lot more. Something that extends back to a lot of the ancient Chinese dynasties as well. Things like acupuncture, things that have been used for thousands of years are now seeing this massive resurgence where people are starting to reject using chemical drugs instead. And like I said, it's like medicine is going full circle. We are here with all of these developments that have been made through the course of 1,000 years. And now we're starting to revert back to a lot of the things that people were using back in the ancient times, and even beyond that as well, going back to prehistoric times. For instance, people using things like lemon and honey to treat something like a sore throat. Honey has been used as, unknowingly, an antiseptic since the ancient Egyptians because it has antiseptic properties within it. So again, that idea of medicine going full circle I just think is so fascinating. A couple of other developments that are worth mentioning that help a lot of the developments that we're seeing in medicine nowadays. In 1953, we've got the development of the discovery of DNA, discovered by Francis Crick and James Watson, which has got a huge part in playing in people identifying illnesses, to see understanding more about hereditary illnesses that are passed down through people's genes as well. We can also kind of attach that to the concept of cloning as well. Also producing body organs, stem cell research, making body organs for transplant, something that we are still perfecting nowadays and looking into. We've got the first open heart surgery in 1950 and the first heart transplant by Dr. Bernard in 1967. So we're seeing huge leaps and bounds being taken in surgery in the later 20th century and into the 21st century as well, where we are seeing developments through anesthetics, antiseptics, and blood control and blood transfusions, meaning that these more complicated procedures are happening. Brain surgery as well. It always fascinates me how people are awake during brain surgery. Absolutely fascinating. But we also have developments surrounding keyhole surgery as well, which has really lessened the impact of the dangers surrounding surgery that's taken place, and also the amount of recuperation time that's needed as well. My husband a couple of years ago had keyhole surgery on his knee, and it meant that rather than having his knee completely exposed and all of the work done on tying things back together, I'm kind of exposing now that I have completely forgotten what my husband's knee surgery was for, but nonetheless, that was done through keyhole, so just a small incision. And it just amazes me that we now have the technology that enables for surgery to happen through tiny, tiny holes in our body, but can still be done in a way that means we can recover a lot quicker from this as well. Another part of that as well is things like endoscopies, which is something that I've had a ton of during my life, being diagnosed with Crohn's disease, which is when you get the cameras that are in these long, thin tubes pushed down into your throat and down into your stomach, so the digestive system can be looked at. So such amazing developments in technology that mean that things that would have been very complicated to do in the past are becoming a lot more straightforward and a lot less, I'm going to use the word traumatic, and I don't mean that necessarily in terms of psychological trauma, but in terms of the trauma caused to the body itself. One of the big changes that we can be seen in medicine as well nowadays is we are focusing a lot more now on how to prevent disease from happening rather than trying to cure it. So for instance, there is a big push on vaccination, even if we are living in a world where there is still opposition to vaccination. In my opinion, the facts and the evidence far outweighs and the benefits of that far outweighs any risks that come with being vaccinated. There's a lot more focus on lifestyle now as well. All of these huge campaigns to try and limit people from smoking, to try and limit people's alcohol intake, and also this big push on obesity, getting people to live healthier lifestyles. For instance, I found it really fascinating that when the lockdown measures were imposed, people were still allowed once a day and were recommended to go out and get exercise once a day. Because again, trying to make sure that obesity can be challenged, which will limit issues regarding type 2 diabetes. And also, I'm just going to put an extension on that because I've not included it in this list here, but also the psychological awareness about exercise and mental health as well. Lots of developments surrounding mental health. I kind of feel that mental health is becoming more, rightly so, becoming more and more of a priority now. And it's almost like it's the disease that needs curing in a way, or understanding better. We also have significant programs for scanning now, for instance, mammograms, which are given to women over a certain age to help them identify any beginnings of breast cancer. Lots and lots of more sophisticated x-rays. I talked about endoscopy beforehand as well. Lots more ways that people can be tested for certain illnesses. Be it, for instance, seeing if you've got any risk factors for colon cancer as well, or bowel cancer. So much is being done now to make sure we can get in there early, because especially things like cancers have a lot greater chance of being treated successfully if they are caught early. So things like, for instance, cervical screening, cervical smears and things like that, which is just so important. This idea that you would go for that once every 5 years to make sure that people can keep an eye on any risk factors for things such as cervical cancer, HPV jabs being given out to prevent that as well. So much more, like I said, is focused nowadays on preventing disease. I cannot think of anything more rewarding in terms of a historian in our world that we live in nowadays, especially with coronavirus, than having studied the history of medicine. I think it is incredibly fascinating. I love how it is constantly evolving. And I think it genuinely makes for citizens who understand the benefits of things like the National Health Service so much better. And there we have it. I cannot believe that that was longer than the industrial medicine one. I had no idea it was going to be quite as long as that, but nonetheless, I really enjoyed that. I know that might sound really crazy. I enjoy all of our videos, to be honest with you, but I just adore medical history. I'm sure you can hear it in my voice and how passionate I am about all of the things that I've mentioned to you here. So I really hope you have found this useful. Do get in touch with me if you feel there are any other areas that you're a little bit fuzzy on when it comes to medical history, and I'll happily explain those a little bit further. Of course, like I said, there's that individuals video you can always check out as well, which goes into more detail for certain of the people that we've spoken about. Don't forget to subscribe and like as well. The likes are really helpful for me because it can help me understand which videos are more helpful and why that might be the case. Please follow me on Twitter and Instagram as well if you'd like. You can find me at One History Help, where I do Instagram especially. I do my weekly live broadcasts for areas that you would like some help on, and also some little historical tidbits here and there, for instance, that I find around and about on the social media sphere. And also you can find me on Facebook too. Just search for One History Help. Thank you so much for your time, everybody, and I hope you are keeping safe and well. See you soon, everybody. Bye.